Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back, way back, to a world of marble arches, sun-baked sand, and very, very loud crowds. Settle in, maybe dim the lights, pull a blanket over your legs, and let the distant echoes of history wash over you. We're going to wander through some of the strangest, most uncomfortable corners of European history, starting with the ancient Romans. Now, when you think of Rome, you probably imagine senators in togas, glimmering triumphal arches, and gladiators who were, of course, professional athletes. But let's be honest, most of the time, it was far less heroic. The Colosseum, that great oval theater of the people, wasn't just a place for sport, it was a place for spectacle, for carefully engineered suffering, and for some very unfair Picture it, a sunny afternoon, a crowd of tens of thousands murmuring like a restless sea. The emperor sits high above, fanning himself with the faintest trace of authority, and below, 2 or sometimes 3 or 4 combatants step into the sand. One of them, often, has been plucked from some far-flung province, looking both terrified and slightly confused. The other, usually a much larger, better-trained fighter, possibly someone who has spent years learning to kill exactly like this. Naturally, they made it worse by pairing them for the entertainment of the public, because, of course, they did. And it wasn't just the gladiators who suffered from poor matchmaking. Emperors themselves occasionally turned the concept of unfair matches into a personal art form. Take, for example, the very young, very unfortunate Commodus. If the name sounds familiar, that's because his reputation is a little notorious. Commodus liked to dress up as Hercules and fight in the arena, because what could possibly go wrong when an emperor thinks he's the star attraction? He apparently staged bouts against dwarfs, the elderly, and even wild animals. Not exactly fair matches, but it must have been a sight to see, and a sight to avoid if you were on the other side of the sand. Speaking of wild animals, the Romans had a particular fondness for throwing someone into a cage with a lion, a bear, or a crocodile because, why not? If a match felt too safe, it simply wasn't entertaining. Sometimes, historians tell us, the gladiator would survive, and sometimes, well, the historians have a slightly more awkward pause at this point, which we can all appreciate. After all, the Colosseum wasn't a place to build Let's drift over to a slightly more bureaucratic kind of The editor of the games, the officio in charge, would sometimes adjust the odds so that a fight had a guaranteed outcome. This might mean giving one gladiator a better sword, or heavier armor to the opponent, or possibly assigning a friend to tip the scales subtly. Essentially, it was the ancient Roman version of a rigged reality show, and the audience, they lo ved Italiano. Nothing says fun afternoon like watching someone's chances of survival gently evaporate in the sun. And yet, even amid the cruelty, there's a peculiar charm to the Roman approach. Perhaps it's the clarity of stakes, or the total commitment to spectacle. Perhaps it's knowing that while we're drifting into sleep, someone in 80 AD had already invented a way to make your life both theatrical and slightly terrifying at the same time. The irony, of course, is that the emperors, who thought themselves clever, were often the most pitiful players in their own games. So when we think of unfair matches in history, it's not just the gladiators who suffered, it's the emperors, the advisors, the senators, all slightly awkwardly navigating a world where power, spectacle, and misfortune were intertwined like the rings of the Colosseum itself. Commodus may have fancied himself a demigod, but to everyone else, he was just a bored man with a club and a sense of entitlement. And that, dear listeners, is often the precursor to more historically unfortunate pairings, which we'll drift toward next. Before we leave the arena for now, imagine the sand underfoot, the sun high and merciless, and the faint, ironic cheer of the crowd. The Romans weren't subtle. They didn't need to be, and perhaps that's a kind of comfort in a strange, melancholic way, knowing that people have always been spectacularly unfair to one another, yet somehow the world keeps turning. Next, we'll gently move on from the Colosseum to a slightly more matrimonial form of disaster, because, as you might suspect, European royal marriages had a particular flair for pairing misfortune with power. But we'll save that for the next chapter, drifting slowly from the sand of Rome to the silken velvet of palaces long past. Now, imagine a palace. Maybe it's gold-trimmed, with tapestries that have probably seen more dust than sunlight, and chandeliers that require at least 3 staff members to polish. This is where European royals did their best to turn personal misery into dynastic responsibility, because of course, they did. Royal marriages were rarely about love. Rarely. In fact, were they about anything resembling personal preference? They were contracts, alliances, strategic maneuvers designed to consolidate power, land, and sometimes a particularly stubborn sense of family pride. The results, unsurprisingly, were complicated. Take the Habsburgs, for example. Ah, yes, the Habsburgs, the Ria family, known for two things: sitting on as many thrones as possible and slowly, very methodically, turning inbreeding into an art form. They perfected the marry dash, your dash, cousin dash, until dash everyone dash looks dash confused approach. By the 16th century, their family tree started looking less like a tree and more like a particularly tangled vine that someone had refused to prune. Charles II of Spain, for instance, was nicknamed the Bewitched because of the tragic combination of genetics and poor health that ran through his veins. He suffered from numerous physical deformities, intellectual disabilities, and a general air of exhaustion, which was probably understandable considering the family had basically decided everyone should marry everyone else. His jaw was so pronounced, it earned its own mention in medical records, and he could barely chew food properly. And yet, he was king. Royalty, as it turns out, doesn't always reward practical health choices. Moving slightly north, we see similar patterns in Austria and France. Marriages were arranged with precision, often between first cousins, to keep the blood pure. What actually happened was the opposite. The more you concentrate the same genes in a single family, the more likely you are to create a catalog of unfortunate traits. Physical deformities, reduced fertility, and, well, a kind of melancholy that is surprisingly easy to detect in portraits from the era. Those stiff smiles. Not vanity. Necessarily they were hiding general familial dysfunction. Louis XVI of France married Marie Antoinette, partly because their countries needed an alliance, and partly because they were both unaware of the chaos awaiting them. She was Austrian, it was French, and both were incredibly young and unprepared for the realities of court life. The result was the perfect storm: political ineptitude, social missteps, and a French public ready to blame someone. Tragically, genetics didn't play much of a role here, but the concept of a marriage arranged without any personal consideration certainly contributed to the general misery. And sometimes, genetic misfortune was compounded by sheer bad luck. Consider Queen Victoria as a descendants who carried the gene for hemophilia, a bleeding disorder that seemed to haunt European royalty for decades. Because of careful or careless marital planning, hemophilia spread from England to Russia, Germany, and Spain, leaving a trail of anxious mothers and very worried doctors. History doesn't tell us if anyone ever actually slept through one of those family reunions, but probably not. Then there are the cases where the match itself was practically a comedic tragedy. For instance, Henry VIII's marriages are legendary not just because of divorces and though there were plenty of those, but because of the sheer, almost exhausting effort to find someone who could produce a healthy male heir. His wives' personal lives were often entirely subsumed into this one objective. Catherine of Aragon endured long years of expectation, miscarriage, and public humiliation. Anne Boleyn, in her turn, became both a political pawn and a tragic figure, only to be executed for reasons historians still debate, but we can safely assume that fertility concerns played a starring role. And yet, through all of this, the royals maintained an air of ceremony. They smiled in portraits, they hosted balls, they signed treaties. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, they were exhausted, frustrated, and often deeply lonely. Love, when it appeared, was either fleeting or tragically inconvenient. And if it didn't appear at all, well, that was simply another day at the palace. As we drift through these centuries of mismanaged marriages, it becomes clear that European royalty had a unique talent: the ability to turn family life into political theater, often at the expense of both physical health and emotional well-being. The dynasties endured, the titles persisted, but the personal stories were full of quiet suffering, awkward unions, and a very persistent sense of irony. Next, we'll glide into the lives of the petty and dysfunctional kings and queens themselves, those monarchs who, despite immense power, often couldn't manage a simple personal decision without causing chaos, heartbreak, or a mild international incident. But for now, just imagine a grand ballroom, tapestries rustling, and a line of underprepared young royals waiting for a ceremony that may very well determine the course of European history, or at least make them mildly miserable. Now, when we think of kings and queens, we often imagine solemn portraits, golden crowns, and perhaps a slightly disapproving expression as they ponder matters of state. But many of them were, well, let's just say, not as competent as one might hope. In fact, some could be positively exhausting in their pettiness. And tonight, we'll float through a few of these gentle disasters. Take Charles VI of France, for instance, nicknamed Charles the Mad, which already sets the tone. He was prone to sudden bouts of insanity. One of his favorite habits during lucid periods, of course, was to believe he was made of glass. That's right, glass. He would wrap himself in protective layers and avoid physical contact, terrified that a bump might shatter him completely. One can only imagine the awkward family dinners, with courtiers tiptoeing around, hoping not to cause a catastrophic glass-shattering incident. Meanwhile, across the channel, we have Henry VIII of England. Now, Henry was more than a little dramatic, probably the original overreaction king. He married 6 times, executed 2 of his wives, and managed to transform personal dissatisfaction into national policy. He also had a flair for extravagant indulgence, commissioning lavish banquets, jousts, and, of course, the occasional political maneuver that left the treasury a bit lighter than he perhaps intended. Henry's life was, in essence, a masterclass in combining personal whim with public spectacle. And then there's Ivan IV of Russia, or Ivan the Terrible. The nickname is apt, because his reign was punctuated by paranoia and sudden violence. He once even accidentally killed his own son in a fit of rage. A tragic story, certainly, but also a vivid reminder that absolute power, combined with volatile temperament, can produce, well, disaster. Still, in quieter moments, one imagines him sipping tior, whatever the Russian equivalent was, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he could have been slightly less terrifying. Petty behavior wasn't limited to the men, of course. Queens could be just as exasperating. Catherine de' Medici of France, for instance, wielded power through subtle manipulation, rumor, and occasional outright terror. She has a reputation for orchestration of intrigue and clever poisoning, though historians debate how much was rumor versus reality. Either way, she certainly knew how to keep everyone else on edge. One can picture her quietly observing a court gathering, a faintly sardonic smile playing on her lips, thinking, yes, let's see how poorly they handle this little arrangement. And then there's the long line of minor monarchs, those rulers whose names barely survive outside footnotes, yet whose personal quirks made life memorable for those around them. Some were obsessed with trivial matters like the arrangement of furniture or the precise color of curtains. Others indulged in bizarre personal habits, refusing to eat certain foods, collecting unsettling curiosities, or insisting that their portrait be repainted every year to account for imagined changes in appearance. It is hard not to feel a kind of sympathetic exhaustion, imagining their courtiers dutifully accommodating such whims. Perhaps the most fascinating part of all this is the contrast between power and competence or lack thereof. These kings and queens could command armies, shape nations, and dictate laws, and yet they might trip over a rug, insist on wearing uncomfortable shoes, or argue vehemently over the wrong shade of royal blue. Absolute authority, it seems, is remarkably compatible with profound personal dysfunction. Even when their reigns ended peacefully, the legacy of their pettiness often lingered. Laws passed, treaties signed, and the occasional execution recorded, all overshadowed by the tiny, human failings that make history quietly, irresistibly interesting. They remind us that no matter how high the crown, human nature, along with its stubborn quirks, always finds a way to make an entrance. As we gently drift from the royal antics to the more vulnerable side of monarchy, we'll move on to the children. Because, of course, being born into royalty wasn't automatically an easy ticket. In fact, it often meant a childhood that was sickly, spoiled, and sada combination that produced future rulers in various shades of misfortune. But for now, picture these courts. Grand halls echoing with whispers, kings fussing over trivialities, queens plotting with subtle elegance, and courtiers trying very hard not to draw attention. It's a slow, fascinating dance of human flaws, all dressed up in velvet and gold. Now, imagine a nursery not quite as cozy as the word suggests. No soft, warm playrooms with toys scattered across the floor. Instead, royal nurseries were drafty chambers, often in stone castles, with very little in the way of comfort. The children who lived there were expected to grow up fast, look delicate enough to inspire admiration, and obey rules that would make even the most disciplined adult sigh. Being a royal child was, in many ways, an early induction into a life of public scrutiny. Illnesses where common nutrition was uneven, hygiene was basic, and medical knowledge was, well, imaginative at best. Smallpox, measles, fevers that we now treat easily, all of them could end to claim young lives. Yet parents, anxious to secure the dynasty, often kept these children alive through a combination of careful care, indulgence, and stubborn hope. Edward VI of England is one such example. The boy became king at just 9 years old, largely because, well, accidents happen in royal lineages. He was sickly from birth, often bedridden, and remarkably intelligent, though entirely trapped within the constraints of the court. One can picture him, pale and thoughtful, reading books while advisors debated everything from war strategy to wardrobe colors. His brief reign was overshadowed by illness and political intrigue, a recurring theme in the lives of royal children. Then there's the story of Charles II of Spain, whom we met earlier. His childhood was a long series of medical struggles and family interventions. Every meal, every slight fever, every small injury had to be monitored closely, which might have been exhausting if one weren't. Also dealing with the pressures of preserving a carefully interwoven genetic legacy. He was surrounded by attendants, tutors, and physicians, all trying and largely failing to ensure he survived into adulthood with some semblance of health and dignity. Of course, not all royal children were sickly, though many were spoiled. Take the young French princess. For instance, lavish clothes, endless tutors, exotic pets, and a constant parade of attendants could produce children who were charming, manipulative, or simply difficult. The combination of wealth, expectation, and isolation often resulted in personalities that were unusually confident or unusually cruel. A royal childhood was not designed for play. It was a training ground, a delicate exercise in producing the next king or queen, with all the quirks and burdens that title carried. Sibling rivalries, too, were complicated by the stakes. In ordinate families, jealousy might manifest in a stolen cookie or a hissed insult. In royal families, it could influence inheritance, marriage arrangements, and even life or death. The story of the Medici children in Florence provides a quiet example. Squabbles over attention from their parents, over education, over early responsibilities, all compounded by the knowledge that one misstep could echo through history. It's no wonder that many grown monarchs retain subtle or not-so-subtle traces of childhood insecurity. And yet, despite all this, there were moments of tenderness. Tutors who genuinely cared, siblings who formed secret alliances, or parents who occasionally allowed a small indulgence. These fleeting glimpses of normalcy make the stories of royal children oddly comforting to consider, proof that even amid illness, isolation, and expectation, human warmth managed to survive, however quietly. By adolescence, many of these children were prepared or forced into arrangements that would define their lives. Marriages, court duties, military service, or the odd ceremonial procession awaited them. Their childhoods, shaped by both privilege and misfortune, were a prelude to the very adult dramas of pettiness, intrigue, and mismanaged dynasties we've been drifting through. As we leave the nursery for now, picture a young prince or princess tucked under a thin blanket in a stone chamber, a candle flickering nearby. Outside, the castle hums with activity. Guards shuffle. The faint echo of distant music drifts down the corridor. And inside, the child dreams, perhaps of a slightly more ordinary life, perhaps of the immense responsibilities that will one day fall upon their small shoulders. So, we've wandered through Colosseum sands, tangled dynastic marriages, petty monarchs, and fragile childhoods. And now, we arrive at the peculiar, ironic heartbeat of royalty itself, the way immense power, privilege, and ceremony coexists with misfortune, illness, and mismanagement. Royal life often appears dazzling from a distance. Glittering coronations, vast palaces, elaborate ceremonies. But step inside, and it's a different story. Absolute authority did not guarantee happiness. In fact, in many cases, it magnified human flaws, making small misfortunes into major crises, and personal quirks into matters of state. Consider Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. He reigned for 72 years, longer than many could imagine. And his court at Versailles is legendary for but behind the gilded gates, life could be exhausting, petty, and profoundly ironic. Nobles were forced into endless ceremonial routines, designed to remind him of their status. Louis himself suffered from obesity, poor health, and an insatiable need for attention. He built one of the most magnificent palaces in Europe to contain human vanity and insecurity, all while quietly hobbling through it with gout. It's a gentle reminder that no amount of gold can protect one from ordinary human frailty. Then there's the English monarchy, where political maneuvering often collided with personal eccentricity. George III, for instance, is remembered for his bouts of mental illness, now often attributed to porphyria, though contemporary accounts also describe irritability, obsession, and extreme sensitivity to slights. Imagine being king, expected to command armies, negotiate treaties, and maintain dignity, all while occasionally convinced that your servants are plotting against you. It's hard to be both sovereign and sane, it seems, and history shows us just how fragile that balance can be. The irony extends to family dynamics as well. Many royals spent decades navigating intrigues, sibling rivalries, and marital alliances, all in the name of securing dynastic stability. Yet, in private, they were often lonely, fragile, or deeply insecure. Catherine of Aragon outlived 3 husbands, bore numerous children, and endured political exile, all while maintaining composure in a court that repeatedly tested her patience. Meanwhile, her stepdaughter, Elizabeth I, grew up under suspicion and confinement, eventually becoming one of the most powerful monarchs in European history. Both women wielded immense influence, but their personal lives were threaded with sadness, vulnerability, and constant negotiation with circumstance. Even the smallest details of daily life carried ironic weight. Royal table manners, clothing, and even choice of hairstyle could ignite crises or scandals. A misplaced word, an improper bow, or a poorly timed sneeze could ripple through courts and councils. Absolute power, when married to human vanity, produces situations that are simultaneously ridiculous and profoundly consequential. And yet, perhaps the most comforting aspect of this irony is its persistence. Across centuries and countries, monarchs struggled with the same basic human challenges: insecurity, illness, envy, and disappointment. The specifics change the architecture, the laws, the fashabut. The underlying story remains the same. Power does not erase vulnerability. Wealth does not remove sadness. In fact, it often highlights it. So, as we drift through history tonight, it's worth remembering that these figures, surrounded by grandeur and ceremony, were still profoundly human. Their misfortunes, eccentricities, and petty obsessions were not anomalized, they were simply amplified by circumstance. And in observing them from the calm distance of centuries, we can feel a quiet connection. The reassurance that human experience, in all its strangeness and imperfection, is universal. As we slowly let our attention shift from the high drama of palaces and coronations, we might also consider the quieter moments. The small victories, the fleeting joys, the tender glances that survive even in the shadows of political necessity. They remind us that history is not just about triumphs or disasters, but about the lived, imperfect, and often ironic human experiences behind them. Next, we'll gently explore some of the lesser, almost comically unfortunate rulers whose reigns were brief, bizarre, or quietly catastrophic, reminding us once again that even the crown does not exempt anyone from absurdity.